Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar series on the future of employee engagement. This is an exciting one. It's a three-part series. Part one we had on Tuesday with me, where we went through comms and impact. If you missed it on Tuesday, don't worry. Each section can be picked up on its own and you can access part one on demand now. So you can catch up with that later. But today we are focused on part two, which is the second part of the future of employee engagement, and that is on embracing the ultra diverse workforce. So before we get into the content, my name is Kaz. I work for Unily and I am the Community and Industry Insights Lead. So I look at a lot of our market insights, our thought leadership, and I get to create a lot of the content that you see today. And I also get to share it at events online and in person as well. So you'll see some of the content that I do online. And if you look at the unily.com website, you'll see some of the research and the blogs and the events. So have a look at those for our latest thought leadership. So if you haven't heard of Unily before, Unily is an employee experience platform and we power organizational velocity for the world's largest, most iconic organizations. You'll see some of those logos at the bottom from the likes of Mars and Johnson & Johnson and British Airways and many, many more. So we have about 5 million employees using our software as a service globally. And more exciting than that, I've worked in the internet industry pretty much my whole life. It's now an exciting point where the biggest analysts in the market are looking at our industry and assessing how are the players doing. And Unily is lucky enough to be the only provider that's listed as a leader across all three of those major analyst reports. So if you want to get into the nitty gritty of the internet game, compare different vendors, see different use cases, how they might work for your organization, you'll see three examples on the screen here from Gartner, Forrester, and IDC. And you can download all three of them from the unily.com website to dive into the detail. So let's get cracking. So you would have seen this slide on Tuesday if you were with me, but just to add a bit of context, when you think about employee experience generally and employee engagement, I highlighted three things that I think we could navigate together and meaningfully impact in our roles, whether you're an internal communicator, whether you're a HR professional, or even whether you're in IT and digital workplace. These are the three things that I think we can meaningfully impact. The first one is about rising employee stress. Gallup, who does the benchmarking on employee engagement, they found that this year was the highest stress level that employees ever reported. 44% of employees reporting that they experienced significant daily stress at work, a record high. So that's something that we need to impact, especially when it comes to employee well-being. The second pain point that I introduced was around connection to mission, vision, and values. Now, this is particularly troubling because we hear a lot about a purpose-driven era of work and what employees want, especially some of the younger generations. But at the same time, it is a juxtaposition with what employees are reporting. They're reporting record low connection to mission, vision, and values. So that's the second thing we can impact. And the third is to do with retention and attrition. So for those of you that are looking to create high-performance workplace cultures, create high-performing teams, there's stats here that show that employees are actively looking to leave their employers, and there's a mentality of kind of like a revolving door of employees. And so you put those three things together, it creates ultimately a disengaged workforce and a real opportunity for organizations to impact those three things so that they can win in the next era. So how do we do that? Well, this section is all on the ultra diverse workforce. On Tuesday, we had to think about how internal communications can have a bigger impact, how we prove that impact, and different ways to prove that impact depending on the organization you operate in. I'm kind of flipping scripts here. So rather than looking at that top-down communication, I'm now thinking about the individual, the employee in the organization. And so this is all about trying to understand, in a workforce that's so diverse, how do we make every individual feel seen, heard, and included? Definitely sounds like a challenge. And I want to know, do you see that challenge? So on your screen, you will see a poll that you can interact with. Let me know, in your role, are you finding it harder to deliver a consistent and inclusive employee experience? No worries if it's either way, just let me know and I will look at the results. Give you kind of 10 seconds to do that and I will look at the results as they're coming in. Okay, cool. So we're seeing about 85, 88% of respondents saying that they agree that it is becoming harder. Okay, and the good news there is if you are one of those people that is finding it becoming harder, you're not the only one. So this research here says that enterprise employee experience leaders across different functions, so it's not just specific to the function you operate in, that they don't really have confidence in their ability to include everyone. Whether that's including everyone in their communications, there are certainly barriers there, or whether it's digitally connecting everyone, or whether it's including everyone in like feedback surveys, for example. There are different layers to this, but 1 in 3 leaders don't have confidence in their ability to include everyone. And that's just to do with including everyone, not just engaging and going further. So we frame the challenge there. So how can we overcome that challenge? And I wanted to take a slightly different view for this topic. So historically, I've been really interested in employee personas. And so I wanted to understand, before we get into those personas, what actually is making this harder? And there were 3 things that I could identify that are really making it harder for us in our roles and for those of you watching to deliver a consistent and high level experience across the organization for different types of the workforce. And they are these 3 things here: the multi-generational workforce, the new employee mindset, and the spectrum of working styles. So let's look at these one by one. So starting with generations. So you probably would have seen a lot of talk on social media, but also on external news websites, for example, the BBC, CNN. A lot of these reports are coming out that are looking at how different generations are having a different approach to the workforce. And so you'll see here, for example, there's quite literally a changing of the generations that are going to be in the workforce. So as the baby boomer generation exit, they're kind of replaced by millennials, especially in some of those leadership positions. And so 75% of the workforce, the US workforce, will be made up by millennials. So a very different makeup there. But also, it can't just be looking at these generations in isolation. You've got to think about how they can work together, because actually this stat from Randstad on the left there says that 83% of execs agree that they are better at innovating when they get that input from different types of generations and how they work together. But I want you to remember, it's not just about generations. That's a consideration, but there's definitely a mindset change across all generations about how they think and feel about work. And you see some of that come to light here. So this Deloitte study looks at how 76% of millennials believe that a company's sense of purpose is a key factor in being an attractive employer. But also, it's more than just company's sense of purpose. People are making different decisions about who they work for and why they work for them. In fact, 40% of Gen Z have turned down an employer that does not align with their values. And that to me is crazy, because I think if I told my grandparents or even my parents that I was turning down a job because there was a value misalignment, I think they would laugh me out the room. But it goes to show some of the different ways people are thinking and feeling about work at the moment. And the third part of it is about everyone's different working styles. It's not just about the mindset and the generations, it's also about different working styles and interactions, whether that's hybrid or remote. There's definitely a growth in that over the last few years. But also in terms of diversity. So 1 in 3 would not apply to a job at a company where there is a lack of diversity in its workforce, but also neurodiversity. So for example, approximately 20% of the workforce is neurodiverse. For example, thinking of ADHD, but also other ways in which people interact with the workplace we need to make accommodations for. So there's a lot of research there, and you kind of put these things together, these research in different areas of the workforce. And what it means is that it is becoming harder to deliver a consistent and inclusive work experience. And we're more aware of it, which is a good thing, I think. But I want to basically leave this presentation, I want to leave this webinar so that you have an idea of the workforce and small changes that you can do day to day that might move it in the right direction and for your company to deliver a more consistent and inclusive work experience. So the way I wanted to do this was I looked across some of Uni's customers to understand who's doing it right, how are they doing it well, where are the good engagement scores, where's the good employee satisfaction and net promoter scores, and like what are some of the underlying things underneath that are charging that. And so one thing I realized, one practice that I saw amongst all those high performing enterprises where there were high engagement scores, high net promoter scores, was that they invested a lot in really understanding who their employees are and what they want and how they want to engage with work. So a big part of that for me is personas. And I've seen a lot of good work happen in personas recently. So people have invested in trying to understand their employee personas. And I think this practice kind of came from marketing. And I think when you think of marketers, they understand the people that they're marketing to inside out. They know what time they wake up, what time they go to bed, what they have for breakfast, if they have a dog, a child, what that dog is called. And so when you understand the nuances of the people that you're trying to market to, you can make decisions that will ultimately delight them. And so if you take that practice and think about it from an internal employee experience perspective, if we apply some of that thinking, we can do a better job at engaging them. So I implore you to kind of think of your employee personas, but not to create some kind of like 2D ChatGPT generated idea of persona. You can use AI to kind of like support the framework, but actually do some work to invest in listening to employees, who they are, what they do, what their priorities are, what are their daily pain points. Because when you do that, you get something like this, which is what you see on the screen. So for the next portion, what I've decided to do is deliver two types of employee personas, and that purposefully I've picked them to exemplify the extremes of the workforce, because I think if we can satisfy some of the extremes of the workforce and their preferences, we'll gather a hell of a lot in the middle. And so this is the first persona that you see here, and I call it Hybrid Harriet. So tell you a little bit about Hybrid Harriet. So Hybrid Harriet used to be in the office 5 days a week before the pandemic. Now is in 2 or 3 days a week, depending on the week, depending on when their team's in, what the schedule is. But one thing to know about Harriet is that her personality type, and it may seem odd to see this on there, but I'm a bit of a geek for personality profiling. So I like to try and understand like what makes people tick, how do they engage with other people. And so one thing to know about Hybrid Harriet is that she's a entertainer personality type, meaning for those of you that work in offices, she's the sort of person that would come in full of energy. You'd smile as she comes in. She'd come sit on your desk. She'd know the name of your family, ask for updates, and that sort of person that carries that energy, enthusiastic, that sort of person. I can kind of resonate with this a little bit, so that's why I can talk to it. But this sort of person, we have to think about in the hybrid workplace, what are the accommodations we have to make so that they feel they are still getting their energy from the workplace, even when they're working from home. Also understanding some of the priorities. I think this is the case for a lot of people now. We want a lot more flexibility, kind of tapping in and out of the workday, having slightly different schedules depending on what's going on in that week and what's going on in your family and home life, for example. And for this sort of person, purpose might be less important. And so not always the case, but for this person, they want to get their job done, but they're getting a lot of energy from work and the network. They want to get their job done, but they want to kind of, when they're done, they're done. And they're not too bothered about some of the other stuff that's happening in the organization. So where does that leave us with this person? So if you look at the data, typically these sort of workers are actually getting into retirement earlier than they need to. And that to me tells me that we are not doing enough to engage them. And we haven't maybe thought about the needs from them and how we engage them in the workforce. So what I've tried to do is distill some of the pain points on the right-hand side that we get with this type of persona. So one of the things might be, especially for these people working in hybrid or remote circumstances, how do they access knowledge that historically they would get in person? Being an entertainer, sort of person that would turn their chair around and ask the person next to them or opposite them to get things done. But also being a social personality type, how do they maintain those strong social networks? How do we make sure that when they're working, that they feel connection between themselves, the workplace, their other colleagues, and so that work doesn't just become transactional? The other thing I'll call out here as well is that point number 5 here, staying in the know through a busy work-life schedule. All employees, especially knowledge workers, will have different schedules. They might be traveling, they'll be in the office at different times, they may have different parts of their work life that's happening. So how do we keep these people in the know of what's happening in the organization so that they can do their jobs better? And especially when there are loads of change programs going on, how do we keep them in the know? So given all of this, gives you a bit of an idea. Take a second to kind of think, right, who is Hybrid Harriet? You might have someone in your workplace that reminds you of Hybrid Harriet. Get to know this person a little bit. And then given what we know about Hybrid Harriet, what are some of the things in the digital employee experience that we can help her interface with to engage better? So for that, I've put together a goal. I've kind of distilled that persona into a goal, which is to build a stronger connection between Harriet and her employer that makes her feel seen, celebrated, and heard. So with that goal, I tried to cherry pick some features, functionality, experiences that will help engage this type of persona, given what we know about her. The first thing I've picked out is a kind of curated comms experience. So for those of you that are internal communicators, think about not just delivering communications in a top-down view or just in an email. How do we socialize that communication that increases the chances that she will want to read that communication, but also socialize it in a way that they can understand it better? So what you see on this curated comms experience here is socialization of the comms that are happening. For example, we know she's a bit of an entertainer personality type. She likes to go into the office and kind of feel connected. So can we show the content that's trending in her location? That's the sort of thing that will kind of inspire her. The middle part here is around what got her team talking, the sorts of communications that people are commenting on, that there's a bit of hype around, because that's the sort of thing that she'll be like, oh, who's commenting on that? What are they saying? Again, increasing the chances of engagement. But also, and I believe quite strongly in this, if you are an internal communicator, showing a face behind the communication, I think is really important. Understanding, showing the authors, the profiles, who they are, so that people understand that comms isn't just a piece of content. Actually, it's people that are in the organization and they have a role to deliver and they are doing different things, socializing it again. And so showing the people behind those communications. The second thing I've picked out is around reward and recognition. How do we make sure that this person is, we said from earlier, feeling seen and heard? And also when they are utilizing different people in the organization to get stuff done, Harriet is the sort of person, a social person that will want to make people feel seen and heard. And so using reward and recognition capabilities, even in this scenario, using a stronger portal that shows more reward and recognition, gives reasons for that reward and recognition, so people can have a bit of a snoop to see what other things are going on in the organization, who's being recognized and why. And also for this sort of person, I mentioned earlier that that these sort of people are typically leaving the workforce earlier than they need to. So understanding that there are different journeys that this person is going on, and that it's not just top-down culture and campaigns that need to happen, but understanding what's important for this individual. In this case, it might be celebrating major milestones in working with the company. So what you see here is like work anniversary, for example. Have you thought about how you're celebrating people on key work anniversaries? So that it might be like a personalized video from a member of leadership, for example. That's what you see on the screen here. And last but not least, I think it's about capturing knowledge. This sort of work has a lot of tacit knowledge. And I say historically working in the office, they would have got stuff done. If someone comes to their desk and be like, hey, I know you know this process. How can I expedite it? Who can I speak to about this? And if they didn't know it themselves, they'll tell you the right person. But in today's digital workplace, we want to equalize access. So I think it's really important that we provide equal access to that knowledge, but also provide the mechanism for the Hybrid Harriets of the world to let the organization know what knowledge do they have, how can they share those tips and tricks and tidbits across the organization so that they can help different generations, people working in different areas across different times, so that the organization can continue to make progress and it's not just isolated to certain locations or to certain people. So that's Hybrid Harriet. We've given you a bit of an idea of what her pain points are, who she is, and how, given what we know about her, how we can basically deliver different things in the digital experience to satisfy Hybrid Harriet. Now I want to kind of pivot to a slightly different persona. And this is Zach, the next gen. So he's the kind of like cool digital native, mobile first type of persona, just entering the workforce, Gen Z. And he's in a frontline worker role, working in retail and store. So what's interesting about this type of persona is that they have certain passions that they want to show in the workplace. So for Zach, it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he's also a bit of a techie. So he wants to kind of see the latest and greatest tech innovations and see what his company are doing in that space too. Personality-wise, he's an architect. What that means is that he's typically more introverted, very different to the hybrid Harriets who's coming into the office and speaking to everyone, more introverted and quiet, but he's still quite an imaginative and strategic thinker. A lot of thinking strategically and planning for stuff going on in his head. So think, how can we tap into this personality type, especially for the role that he's in? Very high in his priorities. He wants to work for an employer that cares about purpose. He wants to not just see what the purpose is, but he wants to see how his organization are progressing towards their mission, vision, and values. How are they doing on their ESG goals? And this isn't just a once a year communication campaign. He wants to actively track progress and see detail, see volunteer days, see how other people are using their volunteer days. That sort of thing is what's going to engage the Zachs of the world. And if you look on the right-hand side here, we've got some of those pain points here. So how can he understand the business strategy and vision? Because he cares about the organization and his role in the organization, he wants to be able to map, how do I, as an individual working in this store, go through all the way to the business strategy? How do I make all those links happen? Secondly, digital identity. Now, this is super important for this generation because they've basically grown up building their network digitally from social media, whether that's Instagram. I'm sure the cool young ones are using TikTok, but what that means is their brain is working different and they kind of understand their network around them and will get stuff done by understanding digital profiles, understanding who they are, what they do, getting an idea of them. Whereas me, who maybe started in the office, I quite like getting stuck into the challenge of just coming in the office, seeing who's about, getting to know them. Some people, especially more introverted types, want to sit back, plan ahead, see who the network is and start building the network. The final thing I will call out here is pain point number 4, which is gathering frontline insights. For this type of employee, it's not enough to just be told what to do. They're quite opinionated about the workplace and how to improve it. So thinking about the mechanisms that we are allowing this type of persona to shape the organization and improve the organization. So frontline insights and sharing ideas to improve the business. So take a second, think about Zach, the next gen. Do you know someone like this? And so what I've tried to do is really get into this type of persona and then do a similar activity, look across our customers and see what sort of digital experiences are working for this type of employee. But also, just to simplify it, what goal does the employer have with this sort of employee? And this was what I distilled it to. How do we connect frontline workers to the broader company vision so that they can execute it, but also make it more two-way, have a stronger dialogue, and that grounds them in the organization? And talking back to the stat from earlier about this kind of revolving door of employees, how do we make sure, in especially frontline roles where there's often high turnover, how do we create connectivity between this type of employee so they feel that they want to stay at this organization and work here? So let's have a look at some of the experiences that are working for this type of persona. The first one probably won't be a surprise, which is new and different types of modes and mediums to engage with content. This thing does resonate with me. So I am not a written first person. I like podcasts, I like video. I spend a lot of time on YouTube, probably too much. And so this is a way I like to engage with content. This is particularly important for frontline workers who have very little time in the day to read content. So have a think about, can we, if we've got invested in a good piece of content that might be written, can we create shorter versions of it? You can see some summaries on the left-hand side here. Can we provide TLDR, like too long didn't read summaries for workers that are time poor to at least engage with that content a little bit? A devil's advocate might say, actually it's really important that they read the whole article. And so what I would argue to that is ask yourself, is some engagement better than no engagement? And have a think about, can we create shorter summaries to target different types of workers that will want smaller bite-sized summaries? But also thinking on the right-hand side here, can we do it in different formats? For example, podcasts, especially if you've got maybe workers that are on the road, for example, can they listen to some content and engage with content that way and use that as a mechanism to engage them? Especially the younger generation are looking for new, more exciting channels and mediums to engage with content. The second one here is probably for those of you designing employee experiences, is taking a step back and thinking, for this type of worker, how do we bring them on a journey to upskill? How do they feel like we are investing in their learning and development? And that learning and development isn't just, hey, you're going to spend the first 2 weeks here in a training course. How can we keep them engaged over time with bite-sized bits of content? It may be some of the content we just saw from the slide before. How do we design that in a journey so that they can keep involved, and that we kind of design it in a way that doesn't overwhelm them, but allows them to continue to engage, upskill over a period of time? And that also is investing in their development, and we're investing in our employees, knowing our company better. It might be understanding our mission, vision, and values better. It might be upskilling in the role as well. So going from an assistant to a manager, for example, and teasing that content over time so the employee feels that they're on a path to something, but that equally isn't heavily invested, lots of money into 2-week-long training courses that cost a lot, both monetarily and in terms of time. And thirdly here is like an ideation portal. So this is the sort of person that might be in a store and they might think, wait, why do we do that way? I've got an idea. And how do you capture that idea? And we saw earlier from Zach, he's a strategic thinker. He's an architect, they call it. So he can look at problems like this and he may not vocalize them. He may want to think about them, but he will think of solutions. So are there the appropriate mechanisms to listen to this type of employee and those ideas? In a previous organization, we trialed something like this for our frontline colleagues that worked in train stations. And one of the best ideas I saw that came out of it was linked to a business challenge, which was better data, like getting better data and better reporting. And a frontline employee gave a completely different lens on that, which was, hey, I noticed that a lot of frontline colleagues in the train station don't input their data from their iPad because their hands get cold. And so they leave their iPad in the office and do it at the end of the day, in which time they forget a lot of that data and don't log everything. So can we have touchscreen gloves so people are more likely to keep their iPads and log that data? Now that's the perfect example, very low tech, right? But it shows that when someone's in that role and they understand the challenge, when you think about business problem of better data, better reporting, us office employees might have a few ideas on that. It might be better technology, it might be different systems or different processes, but someone with a completely new lens on that gives an idea from the front line that says, actually, we can fix this from the front line by touchscreen gloves. And I thought that was a great idea that exemplifies this. And lastly, I did want to go from low tech to very high tech. So conversational interfaces. I'm sure a lot of people on this call will be using digital agents, things like ChatGPT, but you want to do it in a governed way, because I think if you don't provide the mechanism for, we saw he's very interested in tech, right? So this sort of person will test the latest and greatest innovations in AI, but we want them to do it in a governed, safe way in the organization. We don't want them exposing any company information to external tools. So if you don't put in the right policies, the right mechanisms for those employees to engage with it at work, then it will go external. So think about using digital agents to allow these employees to basically have conversational interfaces. And there are different use cases for this. I've seen at Unily, we have, for example, digital agents, you see an example here, to book annual leave. And that simplifies the digital experience, especially for frontline workers who have very little time to interact with technology in the day. They don't want to be having to think about 5, 6, 7 different tools and what tool to go to. Can you simplify that for them through a digital agent? But also, can you give them access to knowledge across the organization? So it might be FAQs, knowledge articles, communications. Can you unite some of those disparate sources, whether they're different apps or whether they're different content knowledge sources, simplifying that for workers through a simple experience that is just easier to engage with, but also easier to allow that person to adopt. So there we go. So we've seen 2 different types of personas there. And I trialed 4 different types of personas for this presentation. I picked those 2 specifically because I think they exemplified some of the extremes of the workforce. And I think when we do that, we can catch a hell of a lot in the middle. So depending on your organization, those personas may or may not work for you. But I really implore you to do some work, start with some data, look at the makeup of your workforce, and then think about how can we add layers to this, socialize it with employees. Do they see those sorts of challenges? Because when you're making decisions, whether that's in your digital employee experience or whether that's whether to prioritize a certain type of communication or a certain campaign, you can do that against the background of, we know our employees. Is this going to work for that employee? Is this what that employee would want? A good way to prioritize and rationalize, especially if you're low on resource. So my key takeaways there are, firstly, listen to your employees. So we looked at some data at the beginning, and there's really lots of interesting data around changes in the workforce, the makeup of the workforce. But start by employee listening, and not just the engagement survey, although that's the start. Think of different types of ways you can get feedback from employees on what's working and what's not working. For example, there might be more like smaller focus groups that you might do to rationalize and get insights on what's working, what's not working. The second key takeaway is to look through the lens of the individual. For those of us designing employee experiences, it can be easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, but make sure you've got an individual lens on this. This is why personas are useful. Think about, is this going to work for Hybrid Harriet? Because then that way you're making sure that actually it does really link to the employees that we have, and we can rationalize from how they're thinking and how they're feeling. And thirdly, sometimes think ground up, not top down. So think about, how can employees engage and design their own experience? How can they contribute knowledge? How can they contribute ideas? How can they contribute their own insights, for example, through blogs, to help the organization create a kind of better digital culture, which isn't putting all the responsibility on communications and HR. So there you go. Accommodating the ultra diverse workforce. I try to do something very different with these personas, and I kind of recommend you do your own work and look at it through the lens that I looked at. Think of their personality type, their priorities, their pain points, and that's probably what I'd recommend. Do those really good detailed personas. So I've set aside some time, about 10 minutes, for question and answer. So in the question and answer panel, you can see the ability to ask questions. You can also upvote on other people's questions. There's nothing here just yet, but I might I'll give you a minute, see if there's anything that comes to mind. Cool. No questions. I think I'll tell you, because I've spoken a lot about employee personas recently, and one common question that I always get, and usually first, is how many employee personas do I create? And I think my answer to that is, there isn't a magic number where you have the number of your workforce divide by number of types of roles. There's no formula that I can give you. But what I would say is, start small and start detailed. So I think I'd rather you create one persona that you know inside out, and you know all the inner workings of what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what their challenges are, rather than trying to create 7 high-level personas that really mean nothing to anyone. So that's a kind of frequently asked question and how to deal with it. So if there are no questions, I will leave you with some further insights. So I picked some further reading for you to look up on. So if you want to catch up on different views on the employee experience, I hosted a panel at Unite, our employee experience conference in London. And I got insights from leading organizations designing their employee experience and their employee experience super team. If you scan that QR code, you can watch that on demand. Also, Unily delivered a keynote at Unite talking about what we think the future of employee experience is and how employee experience is growing into organizational velocity. So you can scan that QR code to see that on demand. Actually, generally speaking, there is a whole host of Unite on demand content that I'd really recommend. So I would recommend looking at the event, looking through the agenda, see what you like, and catching up on demand, especially as we come up to Christmas. There's a lot of cool sessions that you can catch up on. And for those of you that want to see an exceptional workplace in practice, Kerzner is a luxury hospitality chain, one of Unily's customers. I went there to Dubai and captured a case study on the ins and outs and how they became an exceptional workplace. So if you're trying to strive to become an exceptional workplace, become one of the highest achieving from an engagement score, have a look at the inner workings of that Kerzner case study. And that brings it to a close. I can see some comments in the chat, but personas are helpful. Thank you so much. I did some work to try and understand what I think those things should be. So that's definitely a good template. Take them as inspo and use them as like a baseline, and then like definitely iterate. And what I'd say as well is once you've got a baseline, try and socialize that with some of your employees. Be like, hey, we created this to see someone that reflects reflects the workforce. Do you resonate with this? What would you change? Would you add extra detail? Do they have more pain points? That sort of thing. So I'm glad they worked really well for you. Thank you. So that brings me to the close of this session. 2/3 of the way there as part of this future employee engagement series. There's one more session on Tuesday that will be run by my colleague Ashlyn, and this is the techie one. This is really all about optimizing the flow of work. When there are more digital tools and digital communication knowledge than ever, how can you strategically and intentionally design the digital experience to optimize for the flow of work? So that's on Tuesday, so don't miss that. And if you can't make it because you registered, you'll see it on demand as well, so you can catch up later. And please let me know how you found this session. It's the first time we've done these. We've done our in-person masterclasses and pivoted them to deliver them online. Did it work? Did it not work? Let me know. Scan that QR code, unily.com, or actually when you exit this webinar, you'll be taken straight to the form as well. So please let me know what worked, what didn't, any ideas for next time. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you. Till next time. See you later.